You're the inaugural interview for this for this project, and I had the ideas about 3 years ago, and it's taken this long to bring it around to being
Wow.
reality. I only had one heart surgery in between and some other stuff. So and then,
Yeah.
but anyway, thanks for volunteering to do
Yeah.
it.
Well, it's a good idea. I'm there's a lot of there's a lot of oral history uh to be captured out there,
There
and
is,
and
and
I I've been around a while, but there are some people that need to be, you know,
right.
there's some folks out there that have have information that needs to be archived.
That's
So,
true. I've finally got some replies to my request for lists of people to interview, and there's about 35 people who immediately popped up.
okay.
Ed
Yeah.
Matthews is toward the top of the list.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so, and I picked you because I knew you, and I've talked to at least one other Methodist who said that's a really good idea to catch you. So,
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, well, you know, I've got my perspective for sure. So,
yeah, well, uh,
yeah,
my excuse was that you're easy to talk to and you've been around. So,
yeah. Well, and I've had a well, I'm a cradle Methodist, you know,
mhm,
uh, and it's I consider the United Methodist Church my family. That's what
yeah,
it feels like to me.
yeah. So, to the question list, your roots, where's your origin?
Yeah. Okay. So I grew up in Wynne, Arkansas,
Mhm,
as part, and my family was in First United Methodist Church in Wynne. Very very active in it. My both my parents served in a variety of positions. But I was thinking about this, and I was remembering the first minister that I remember as a child was a guy named John McCormick, and many people in Arkansas knew and loved John McCormick. But what I remember about him is just um, how uh, he had genuine affection for me. Is what it felt like.
mhm,
Now, I'll say this: the man liked to duck hunt, and my family had a place to duck hunt, and but that's often the way that works, and but I remember I was like 7 years old, and that's when I first started duck hunting, and to be on, here's a little sideline. On my first duck hunt, I I killed two mallards with one shot with a 410 shotgun. It was just a pure accident. They were just unfortunately were lined up right by each other, and I was shooting at one and got two. And John McCormick just made the biggest deal in the world about that I had
yeah,
killed those two ducks with one shot. But anyway, I love John McCormick, now, and as a child you don't know the dynamics of preachers coming and going, but apparently he there was a I think John McCormick left Wynn before he was wanting to leave Wynn. I'll put it that way, but I sure didn't understand why my beloved pastor John McCormick had to leave. That's a vivid memory to me of just kind of how this itinerant system
oh yeah,
worked.
yeah,
That there often are people who, you know, there's always different perspectives on that. And I think many of the adults in the church were ready for that to happen, maybe. But as a
hmm,
child, I was like, he's a great guy. Why would he need to go?
mhm,
A little sideline so I was 7 years old. Years later, and I was in college. Um, I took just a solo bicycle trip from I rode my bike from Wynn to Fayetteville and back. You know, it was kind of a 8-day ride, you know, I stayed a couple of days in Fayetteville. But the way I did it, I didn't contact people in advance. I just showed up places thinking I'd call and find a place to stay. And one night I ended up in Harrison, Arkansas, and she wasn't a girlfriend, you know, in that sense, but a girl that I knew from Fayetteville lived in Harrison, and she was a friend, and I thought her family would probably put me up. Well, I never could make contact. I just couldn't find out who they were in Harrison. And I was sitting on the city square at dusk, racking my brain of who I might know in Harrison, Arkansas. And I remembered that John McCormick was the pastor in Harrison, Arkansas. Just, you know, just kind of, you know, I knew that's where he was. I called him out of the blue and had hardly seen him for a decade. And he knew who I was, and he came and got me and took me home and fed me and just well, every time I saw him after that, when I became a minister and would see him at conference, he would see me and he loved to talk about how much I could eat at that point. Of course, you know, I'd ridden my bike from Mountain View that day. So anyway, but you know, I think that illustrates the nature of the Methodist family. I think, that's kind of how it works at best. I think, you know, you've got these connections that don't expire, you know. So I grew up First Methodist Church in Wynn. It's a really strong, good church. I'll name a couple of people, another person that was instrumental in my life and I think in Arkansas Methodism, who is Emily Cockrell. Emily Cockrell was the education director in Wynn and played a role both in conference education projects, but she was a lovely person that just gave me nothing but encouragement and, you know, you know, I would say she generated interest in the church for me, because she made it a place that felt good to be, and she was very involved in the United Methodist Youth Program, and it was a good experience. You know, Wynn has not produced many pastors. I'm in a small little fraternity. Well, I say fraternity. There was one other pastor that came out of that church prior to me, Jim Clemens, who is he is a he was a big presence in Methodism. He's written this book, A Crisis of Conscience, that we've talked about in our study group reading, about how United Methodist in Arkansas dealt with desegregation and civil rights. He edited that. He went on. He was a professor at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington. Really intellectually gifted man that came out of Wynn, Arkansas. And when I went into ministry, he really sort of took me under his wing. He wanted me to. He was very supportive of me. I mean, he felt like we were in a small fraternity. because we're basically the only two pastors. I have to, you know, technically, and Mary Cartwright, Mary Wilder
Hmm.
was the daughter of Bill Wilder, who was a pastor there when she graduated from high school, and she went into ministry.
Huh.
So you might say there's three people who graduated from high school and went to go into ministry, and those are the only three that came out of that church that I know of.
Huh.
Maybe more, but anyway.
Mhm. Oh.
So yeah, I went. And well, you know, you talking about people,
Mhm.
you know, and people influential for me. So when I was in starting college and just didn't know what, you know, I was kind of a Jethro Bodine character, you know, wondering if I should go to be a fry cook or a brain surgeon. Um, uh, Emily Cockrell encouraged me to go meet Lewis Chesser. When I ended up going to Fayetteville as a sophomore in college, I was heading up there thinking I'd be a mechanical engineer.
Oh.
But she said I should go meet Lewis Chesser, the director of the Wesley Foundation. And then that was amplified by the pastor of the time, Arvil Brandon. I remember him talking to me one day saying, "You should go meet my friend, Lewis Chesser." They all encouraged me to go to the. So I was like, okay, I guess I should go by there. And look, and I did. I went to Fayetteville as a sophomore. And that was a life altering
Hmm.
introduction. I
Yeah.
mean, Lewis was a rare bird, a rare, and I needed a rare bird to be around. You know, I really connected with him.
Hmm.
He rode a bicycle. You know, that's how he commuted to work. I was a huge that was my primary affection in those days, was riding a bicycle. I've told people, you know, my dad was a Chevrolet car dealer, and so, you know, instead of the preacher's kid that raised hell, I was the car dealer's son that rode a bicycle everywhere. uh, and you know, those were the days of the this was late 70s. I graduated from high school in 76.
Mhm.
Days of energy, you know, we'd had the oil embargo, you know, a couple of years earlier, and I had really, you know, Jimmy Carter was the president. I was I was ready to sign up for his war on energy consumption. You know, I consider that to be a huge challenge of our day. And
Yeah.
and actually, I went to Fayetteville hoping to get into solar technology. That's what
Oh.
I had hoped to go into mechanical engineering. But you know, they were not talking about solar technology in the mechanical engineering department in Fayetteville at the time. They were, you know, they were building widgets, you know, and calculus, you know. I, I made it through Cal 2, went to the first day of Cal 3 and said, I can't do this,
Yeah.
you know, and got into my degree was environmental science. That was my undergraduate
Mhm.
degree.
Huh.
Just which meant I knew a little bit about everything and not much of anything. It was a new degree. You had the intro class to every science up there. So, but while I was in school, I just lived at the Wesley Foundation, literally a couple of times, not all the time, but there was some housing there.
Mhm.
But Lewis just was my, you know, he became my um, portal into ministry. I loved what he did. We would have a service on Sunday mornings where he would give a little homily, and then he invited response. And it really was the first time for me that I ever heard anybody actually portraying Jesus in a way that wasn't scary to me. I think, I don't know, he 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 really introduced Jesus as someone who was engaged in society, um, on the side of those who were victims of society. It really touched me deeply to
Hmm.
participate in that. And it wasn't the Wesley Foundation program was. I mean, there was a community connected to that place of, you know 50 people. I don't know, numbers escape me, but we never had 50 people gather for anything. It was always just very people just hanging out, uh, talking about the issues of the day. And there was just this parade of hippies, artists, poets. Lewis was a poet, did a Master of Fine Arts
Huh.
in Fayetteville while he was the pastor or the Wesley Foundation director.
Uh-huh.
Very accomplished poet, and took it very seriously and was peers with the, you know, Miller Williams was one of his peers,
Hmm.
one of somebody he hung out with, and studied under, uh, and so there were these. It was a rich collection of people. It's the late '70s, and so there were a lot of holdovers from the, kind of civil rights struggles of the day. So I my introduction to to this, it was a radical form of Christianity that I kind of got exposed to and was stimulated by, and so when I graduated from high school, I didn't know if I wanted to be a pastor or not, but I knew when I graduated from college, I I I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted more exposure to the teaching of Jesus, just kind of this whole history, this whole community of Christianity. I was hungry for that. And so Lewis had been to Duke Divinity School, and I'm like, well, I think I'll go to Duke Divinity School. I didn't apply anywhere else.
Uh-huh.
I just applied. I remember vividly going out there for a visit, meeting with the director of admissions. Her name was Paula Gilbert. I forget a lot of people, but I don't forget this. She was a nice looking woman, uh, very had a large presence in the room, and intimidating. I was intimidated by her. I'll put it that way.
Hmm.
And and not in a horrible way, but it's like, I remember she said, you've written a very compelling essay on wanting to go to seminary, but you have not said a word in here about going into ministry
Huh.
and pastoral ministry. And she said, the United Methodist Church gives us $1 million a year, and they expect us to produce pastors. Have you thought about being a pastor? And I'm like, yeah, let me get back to you on that. And I had to go home, and I remember I wrote her a letter, said, yeah, I'm open to it. So they let me in, and I I made it through it. So
Yeah.
yeah,
So,
but I was, as a seminary student, I was very much into liberation theology, kind of the theology of the time that was very, you know, how Christianity, how it connected with the marginalized in the world, and it was a very strong movement at the time. One of my professors, Fred Herzog, had written a book, a theology of liberation. I mean, I was very steeped in it, and probably not so steeped in how to be a pastor.
Uh-huh.
But got out and applied for ordination. I was actually denied the first time I applied for ordination as a probation. It's a two-step process. You apply to be a probationary member. And I took that very seriously, that I was applying for probationary membership. So I did answer every question in the way I thought they actually wanted to know what I thought, not what I was supposed to say.
Uh-huh.
And, I think I got tripped up on the infant baptism issue. I said I would, yes, I'll baptize infants. My issue was, aesthetically, I was not a believer's baptism. I didn't think I wasn't a Baptist about this. I just thought, why don't we wait until a child's old enough to know what's going on before we do this, so they can kind of have the experience of baptism. Well, that raised a lot of red flags, and so they didn't say, no, don't go away and don't come back. They said, no, go away and come back, after you've read these things and know, what a Methodist is supposed to do. And so I did, and got in and navigated that gauntlet. But you know what? It really did give me a little preview of what my experience would be professionally. And I think it was kind of as a little bit of a suspect, that was a good perspective on me. I think I deserve to be a suspect on some level. I was not just gonna be the guy I was actually gonna say what I thought occasionally, So, so you may want to go in a different direction, but I'll just tell you, my first appointment was Mammoth Spring.
Okay, I was wondering how you got back to Arkansas. Yeah.
Yeah. So after I finished, and my wife, part of why I think they denied me was I stayed in North Carolina a year or two after graduating from seminary, because my wife was in school, and at that time I was not working professionally in a church. I was doing home repair on our house and taking care of our we had a 1 and 2 year old at the time, so I was kind of like a house husband more than I was anything else. And I think that it made them wonder how serious I was about coming back. So they wanted to wait and see if I was actually going to come back, and I did, and they appointed me to Mammoth Spring mid-year. Normally, appointments are in June. This church had an abandoned, had an empty pulpit in January, and that's when I showed up. And it was a church in crisis. They had a wacky pastor who had just flamed out, and it sending a fresh pastor into a church in a little bit of a crisis, that's not a good formula for success for the most part, because I had preached a dozen times in my life, and here I was preaching two different sermons, or I had 2 services in the mornings and then a Sunday evening service, and it wore me out.
Yeah.
I just was, it was, I have a little bit of PTSD when I drive into that town or get close, because it just was really painful and hard. And, and that church had, it was a, you know, there were issues. You know, I don't want to portray it as a horrible place. We, I had some really tough relationships in that church. I mean, some pain. It was a, it was a bloody mess the whole time. But some wonderful things happened. We met a friend who is our close friend to this day from that church, you know, and I got to tell you this story. Here's a story of something that happened to me. So the woman who was the chairman of the PPR, she was my next door neighbor, and she thought a lot about herself and her position, you might say. And she, you know, she did not want me to leave. That's not, but she wanted me to take a little bit more direction from her. And so in order to kind of, you know, wield some influence, she took it upon herself to do a survey on me. She just kind of did she decided to call up a lot of different people in the church and ask what they thought about how I was doing.
This is a performance evaluation for you.
Yeah, you know, which was not by the book. I mean, you know, it was her own creation of a performance evaluation. And she called a bunch of people and, you know, got their responses. And I actually ended up getting a typed up document that was and I have lost this document.
Oh, no.
I hope to find this somewhere in my stuff, but at this point, it kills me but it was called the Complaints and Praises of the preacher at Mammoth Spring United Methodist Church.
Uh-huh.
And it had one page of praises. It was about, you know, 2/3 of a sheet of praises, and then there were 2 pages of complaints. And she actually had documented the percentage of people who said each one of these things. It was a remarkable little document.
Yeah.
So in the process of that, I went to visit this elderly man in the church who was great old guy. I mean, I love this man. Hobart Simers was his name. Hobart, I went to see him, and he was homebound at the time. And Hobart said, "Well, you know, a woman gave me a call the other day, wanted to know what I thought about the preacher." And he said, I told her I thought he was probably doing a pretty good job. And she said, "Well, you know, there's some people who aren't real happy with some of the things he's doing." And he said, "You know," so I told her, I said, "Well, you know, there were a lot of people who didn't like what Jesus Christ did, but that doesn't mean there was anything wrong with him."
Good point.
Which is just one of the best things anybody ever said to me in terms of my ministry, right there. I cherish Hobart Simers and his assessment of what was going on. So, you know, that's kind of always been my experience. You know, you run into some horrible circumstances, and then you have find these little gems along the way too, you know.
Right.
I will say I had one of the most painful experiences in ministry there, apart from the whole dynamic of that survey. But one night in worship, and it's hard to even know how to tell this story, but I had tried to institute a service in which I would, um, you know, read a scripture, say a few words, and then invite some response. I mean, there was only 15 people in the whole worship service. It was very informal.
Yeah.
And I remember the issue that night was hospitality. I had just kind of been going on with the importance of hospitality among Christians. And man, Spring is a entirely white community. I don't know, I mean, there might have been a person of color who passed through but it was a very white community. And there was a form of racism up there that I had not really experienced growing up in East Arkansas. I
Mhm.
mean, I think up there, African Americans were just kind of unknown and to be feared, and there were a few people that had some hatred in their hearts, and like I say, it's hard to even know how to describe. I mean, the language that was used. Well, I'll tell you what. This Here's how this whole thing came up. I was talking about hospitality.
Mhm.
An elderly gentleman in the church asked this question, and I thought it was he did not ask this question out of malice. He asked it to know my opinion. Um, uh, he said, Pastor, uh, why is it you think uh, Black people don't like to be called with, and he used the N word.
Mhm.
And like I say, it almost felt like it was a child asking a question like that,
Yeah.
And so I tried to answer him in um, like he was asking a genuine question. I said, well, it goes back to when Black people were owned,
Yeah.
and it's a term that it's like people were referring to their property. And so it's a very dehumanizing term. I tried to just give him a straight answer to a really bizarre question.
Yeah.
And he seemed satisfied with that. Well, another man there, I I won't even say what he said because it's just so ugly. But in his response, he used the N word in a way that just expressed hatred. His comment
Mhm.
and his comment was just uh, so hateful.
Yeah.
I mean, it was it just caught my breath.
Mhm.
And I said, and to that, and I'm sorry, I don't even want to say what he said
No, I
because
understand.
it was just I have told that story. I told it one time at UALR in a sociology class, kind of just talking about my experience in the church.
Mhm.
And I found that it hurt. There was an African American student who just got up and left the room when I told that story
Yeah.
because and so I just realized but anyway, he said a very hateful thing. This man in Sunday evening worship service.
Yeah.
And I said, I called him my name. I said, you know, that that's the most hateful thing I think I've ever heard said uh, anywhere. and we had a benediction and left. You know,
Hmm.
I was. We had a PPR meeting the next day. You know, pastor parish relation, and their recommendation was we no longer have any discussions in Sunday evening worship. You know, so anyway, it so it, you know, you run into all kinds in church, you know, and
Right.
the best and sometimes sort of almost the worst, you know.
Yeah.
But so yeah, Mammoth Spring, that was a tough time, and for probably for them and me, but uh, it was rich. It was rich, and
So
and so
how long did you stay from after that moment?
okay, I don't know how long after that moment. It might have been soon after that I left. I was there for a total of 2.5 years.
Oh, okay.
Here and I, I went from there to be the associate pastor at at Lakewood Methodist, North Little Rock,
Mhm.
where I stayed 4 years.
Hmm.
Uh, here's a little Methodist history. I think I might have made history there in the sense that after it was a good my time at Lakewood was it was a respite. I mean, I didn't
Hmm.
have those blood, you know, of course I was the associate pastor, so I wasn't the main target of,
Right.
you know, whatever, but that was a really good experience for me.
Hmm.
Uh, I'll, I'll say two things about that. When I was at uh, Lakewood Methodist, I worked with a man named Jim Wallsmith.
Hmm.
He was the music minister. He had been there for years. He was one of the most capable music. Well, I've met other capable music ministers, but he was so capable. He had a great youth choir program. He had bell choirs. He had several different ensembles that would sing and worship. He had been to Vanderbilt uh, theological education school. It wasn't a divinity school, but he was theologically trained, and our worship service was as liturgically correct as anybody in Arkansas. It was very well done, and it was a good team. Uh, Jim, uh, after I'd been there a few years, there was we, we we had a change in pastors, and the new pastor was did not he and Jim didn't get along so well. They were on different pages, you might say. And that new pastor used the fact that Jim was gay
Mhm.
to uproot him. It's not because Jim was doing a bad job. It it was in my opinion, it was because Jim had more authority than the new pastor. It turned into a battle about Jim, and I had worked with Jim Wallsmith 2 years. I didn't know if he was gay or not. That had never been on the screen. It never came up. I didn't know. I worked with Jim all the time. It just was that was not part of who. And anyway, but there were people, and his sexual orientation came up, and he knew he was a diaconal minister, so he had a credential in the Methodist Church.
Mhm.
But we all know what the discipline said, and he's like, I'm not going to pretend like I'm not gay, and I don't have a leg to stand on. I'm gonna leave. He quit. He quit. Went into teaching high school, and then had some other. He's had a very successful life beyond that, but we lost a very capable person
Mhm.
because of the doctrine of the United Methodist Church. That sensitized me to the problem of the language and the discipline that is so restricted. that was the first time I had just even thought about that whole, the politics of gender issues, or I mean, not gender, but sexual orientation
Right.
issues. So that was really painful. And at some point I was like, I was ready to go. And so after 4 years, I'm like, I want to go. I'd had a good run there. Uh, I'll make this short. I was really lobbying for a church that I thought I would fit in really well. It wasn't a high paying church. It was just a circumstance that I thought I could flourish in, that I knew, and the pastor there was leaving. I lobbied hard for that. I didn't get it. In my humble opinion, what they did was they sent a pastor who was in trouble somewhere else there, because that church didn't pay that much and he couldn't do that much damage there. So they sent the guy that was in trouble, not the guy that had been, I mean, I wasn't long into ministry, but I'd done a good job. They didn't send me, and it made me mad. It kind of opened my eyes to how the itinerant system works sometimes.
Mhm.
And I was near quitting. I was just near quitting.
Huh.
And I was gonna quit before I was gonna go somewhere that I didn't think I would fit. And over the course of that springtime, when they are sorting out preachers out, because I had said I'm ready to go. I need to go. I told the district superintendent, he offered 3 different churches.
Mhm.
He offered 3 different churches, and there was some reason that I could not go, that I just felt like it would not work for me to go to the. I said no 3 times. I've never known another pastor who said, and that's your only option as a pastor. You can say no, when the bishop, but when you say no, that either means your next option could very likely be worse, or the bishop could declare you as unappointable. I mean, I knew that was a possibility. He might just say, well, if you're not going there, you're not going anywhere, and good luck. But they kept, my district superintendent was Herschel McClurkin, great guy, just one of the real sweet angels of the United Methodist Church, Herschel McClurkin. He stayed with me. He offered, he offered 3 different churches, and I'm like, Herschel, I appreciate it, but no, I can't go there either. I said no 3 times, and he came back a 4th time, and he offered West Helena.
Huh.
And my wife and I, we said, yeah, we can go to West Helena. And then, so that was my next appointment, was West Helena. And that was a good experience in many ways. A good church. I liked it. It was a good match for me. A different part of the world, but there's something rich about that part of the world. But the schools were in such turmoil, or I mean, it was just a mess of a school system. We had young children. We didn't want to go to the private academy. So our kids were in public school. But the public school, you might say, here's what it came down to. My son in the 1st grade got paddled for talking during lunch one day. And this is after my wife had made it very clear to the administrators, we do not discipline our children with corporal punishment. That was my wife is a crusader in that regard, that disciplining children does not have to involve physical punishment. And so when Lucas got, we didn't even know what happened. He just got to where he hated going to school in the first grade. He told his sister what happened one day. Well, and she told my wife, and my wife set up a meeting with that assistant principal that he probably still remembers to this day.
Yeah.
She wouldn't let me come to the meeting because she thought I might be a moderating presence. So,
Uh-huh.
but anyway, schools, the school system was so just kind of broken, and that's why I put in for a move from there. And that's when the Wesley Foundation at UALR came open, and that was a great fit for me. And I think it's safe to say I was the only person in the conference that wanted to go there. They had actually opened it up to anybody who wanted to, who wanted that role, to come meet with the personnel committee, and I was the only person that showed up to seek that position. So
Yeah.
I got it.
Neat.
And yeah, and I was there 13 years. That was my longest run. Yeah.
Good fit.
It was a good fit. And a very non-traditional ministry in some ways. I think I did a really good job of creating a hospitable community, for just anybody. It became, ULR was kind of noted for not having much community life, and I think I just kind of created a space for people to come hang out, and that my guiding principle was to offer the hospitality of Christ, and that's what I just tried to. I made thousands of cookies. That's what I did. I baked cookies, cooked food. I was kind of like, I think for a lot of students, I was a cross between, I was like a surrogate mother / bartender. I just sort of, I had a kitchen that was open to the big room, and I just spent most of my time in the kitchen, either cleaning up or baking cookies and coffee and letting people talk and trying to connect people with other people. I just always was, anytime somebody came in the room, I just wanted to make sure they knew who else was in the room and who this person was, and just trying to make connections. So that was my ministry for 13 years.
Wow. So a lot of inquiring minds came.
They did. Yeah.
Just created an environment for conversation and community.
It was. And I'll tell you what, here's where I became sensitized to the issue of handicap accessibility. The Baptist student ministry building, they had larger programs, they'd kind of put on some big production things, but their building was hard to get in. And my building, every time I did something, I just made sure my building, and I guess I met somebody early on in a wheelchair. I just made sure if you're in a wheelchair, you could get in my building. You could be anywhere that anybody else was going to be there. And it involved a whole lot of ramp work around the outside. And I'm a compulsive builder. So I just built things, during the summers, one summer I built a large outdoor pavilion that was covered. And then with ramps where you could get to it, with without even having to go in the building, in case something was going on inside the building. Classes would meet in the building sometimes. So if the class was going on, you could just skirt around the outside and get to the outdoor pavilion. And then I ended up, building the yurt. That was a huge, that's one of my claims to fame, was building the yurt. And it was fun. I had great, but making my building handicap accessible, people in wheelchairs gravitated to our place. It was not unusual for me to be in to be in the room with 3 people who were in wheelchairs. And and maybe, I should say my father's mother, my grandmother, was a quadriplegic. So I guess I had some innate sensitivity to that issue.
Yeah.
But I also came to see that it was a draw. I mean, it wasn't, you do it right and people show up. So and I made just lasting friends because they could get in the building. So
welcoming from the get-go.
Yeah, that was important to me. And so and while I was there, I also had some secondary jobs. It didn't pay enough as a full-time position early on. So I had 2 different churches that I was a pastor of for, I think, 5 of those years.
Huh.
And then I also worked at Camp Aldersgate during the summer for, I think, 4 years, just operating running one of their summer programs. And that worked out well. To, the summer I had off a little bit so I could go do something else. So, Camp Aldersgate being one of the great United Methodist institutions here in Arkansas, and I loved the connection I got to make there. I'd always known of Camp Aldersgate and respected it, but I grew to love Camp Aldersgate and what it's the work it's done in so many different ways. It's just a great place. So all right, so I'll finish my trek, from the Wesley. At some point I'm like, I need to go. I'm ready to do something else. I was ready to. I think when I built the yurt, it was like, I'm not going to get to do anything better than that. So, I got that done. I was just ready for a new gig. And that's, Quapaw Quarter came open, a church I had often wanted to go to, and it came open and I got appointed there. And that was a good match. I was there 6 years, but I tell you what, I poured my heart into that work, and it being, kind of notable as a inclusive worshiping community and very mission oriented, very open to people of different sexual orientations. Here's one of my claims to fame here in Arkansas Methodism. When I was there, we were the first church to become the first congregation to become affiliated with the Reconciling Ministry Network, which is where you just declare you have to have a welcoming statement saying we welcome people of all sexual orientations, and that's that became our sort of our identity. Yeah. And I was happy about that. We did that. I never could turn the corner in terms of making it financially viable, where we were paying all our apportionments, having the number of people in worship that we needed. I just never, I mean, I never cracked the code, you know. That building, there are just so many challenges, you know. I mean, there's no parking lot. So how do you
Right.
even get, it's just, and that building is so, it's beautiful and it is a nightmare of maintenance, you know. And
Yeah.
but I loved it, and then I just, you know, I'm like, I've given it my best shot. I don't know how to I don't know how to make this machine operate, you know, as it, you know, in a viable way. You know, we always limped along. We made it, but it just, we never turned the corner on true, what I considered viability. And so I asked to leave, and I was sent to Newport for,
Yeah.
and that was a lovely, that wonderful people in Newport. But when I went to Newport, I knew that was my last. Uh, I wasn't going to be going anywhere else. That was,
Yeah.
I knew that, and I didn't know how long I would be there. But after 3 years, I had a grandchild here in town. I had put in enough time to access uh, retirement funds, and I, so after 3 years, I retired and have not looked back. You know, so that's been my sort of my career.
Mhm. So you know, your timing is impeccable. I mean, we've got about 97 seconds left or something.
Okay.
But you
All
know,
right.
what I find really exquisite about your story today is that I'm sure it was full of a lot of angst and anger. I'm sure it was a lot of understanding and struggle. But you end it with a smile on your face and a song in your heart, kind of deal.
You know, I I, I chair I it worked. It was a good run for me. I left without bitterness, without I and I I st- I s- I still love the United Methodist Church. I'm proud to be one. And so yeah, you know, it wasn't, I it it was a interesting, uh it was a good run. It was a
Yeah.
good run.